Vice President Teresita Jones Thomas.
Greetings. On behalf of our president, Melanie Frazier, and almost 600 members of the Greater Cleveland Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, we celebrate 100 years of sisterhood, scholarship, service, and social action in the greater Cleveland community, because social action is what we do. I would like to welcome you to tonight's Stephanie Tubbs Jones Social Justice Series on Race, Democracy, and the Electoral College. Thank you to our guest speaker, Mr. Ellis, for lending insight and understanding for tonight's topic. Thank you to our social action chairs and committee members for presenting this much needed platform for you tonight. Once again, thank you for attending and enjoy the discussion.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, truly, in Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, social action is what we do. Throughout this election season, we have registered, educated, and mobilized voters in order to maximize participation in the electoral process. At the same time, we recognize that preserving and expanding democracy is greater than any one single election. Today's discussion, Race, Democracy, and the Electoral College, is the inaugural Stephanie Tubbs Jones Social Justice Series, named in honor of our dear late SOAR and Congresswoman, who served as a U.S. Representative for Ohio's 11th Congressional District until her death in 2008. In this series, we will address critical topics pertaining to social justice for long-term, lasting, and impactful change. At the end of the session, we will share a link to complete a brief survey to help us plan future entries in the series. We'd love your suggestions for topics that are relevant and interesting to you. And throughout this session, you may submit your questions in the chat. Congresswoman Stephanie Tubbs Jones once said, "Everybody expects that their vote's going to count." Yet we have seen as recently as the 2016 election that the will of the popular vote was overridden by the Electoral College. Like so many issues that dilute or suppress the vote, historically and practically, race and racism has been a factor in the design, implementation, and continued use of the Electoral College to determine the victor in the one office that is actually nationally elected. So tonight, we invite you to fully engage as we explore the intersection of race, democracy, and the Electoral College, what we can and should do about it, because every vote truly should count.
Right. Thank you, Cheryl Lindsay. Cheryl serves as one of my co-chairs, so thank you. And again, most of you know me. I have the distinct honor of introducing tonight's speaker. Really excited about this conversation. I don't know if Barbara T. Harris is on, but she requested this. So if not, we'll make sure that we get her the video on YouTube as we are recording tonight's program. Atiba R. Ellis is the Laura B. Chisholm Distinguished Research Scholar and Professor of Law at Case Western Reserve University School of Law. A nationally noted voting rights scholar, his primary research focuses on how racial and class-based oppression continues to abridge and deny the right to vote to communities on the margins of American democracy. His work has analyzed voter identification laws for their socioeconomic effects, situated felon disenfranchisement laws as enforcing a political underclass, analyzed the theoretical scope of the Citizens United decision, and described the ideological drivers of vote suppression. His work is interdisciplinary in nature, spanning doctrinal legal analysis, critical political theory, race and law, legal history, and innovative legal pedagogy. Professor Ellis's current research focuses on how ideologically driven conceptions of wrongful voters, diminish the right to vote. He has also written on critical legal theory and legal history. Moreover, he is currently working with his co-authors to publish a new edition of the late Derek Bell's foundational textbook, Race, Racism, and American Law. Um, he has numerous degrees, A.B.M.A. and JD from Duke University. He served as a judicial law clerk for Judge James Beatty Jr. of the U.S. District Court of the Middle District of North Carolina and Judge Theodore A. McKee of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. He then practiced as a litigation associate at Aiken, Gump, Strauss, Howard, and Feld in Washington, D.C. He began his teaching career in 2006 at the Howard University School of Law and then served at the West Virginia University College of Law from 2009 through 2018. Prior to joining the Case Western Reserve faculty, he served at Marquette Law faculty as a tenured professor and the Bowdoin Visiting Professor of Law in the fall of 2017. The Greater Cleveland Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta welcomes you, Professor Ellis.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and privilege to be here and to get to talk to you all today about the Electoral College and about democracy and representation generally. I realize the heart of this is the Electoral College, and that's what you're interested in. But in talking today, I want to situate the Electoral College in a larger theme, and I'm going to call that theme democracy distortion. And the main idea here is simply that the democracy that we enjoy today is a product of 2 centuries of rewriting what was originally designed in terms of the founders, in terms of the scope of what was meant. And to put it simply, and I, in fact, am going to turn on a timer to make sure I do not take too much time because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. So let me turn on my timer. All right. So the idea, and in fact, the other thing I want to do is share my PowerPoint. So that way we can read along together. The Electoral College affects the presidency, certainly. It is the way the president is elected. And as those warm introductory comments stated, it is the one office in the country that belongs to the entire country. But it is representative of this larger problem in terms of the design of the U.S. Constitution. What I want to stress tonight is that the design of the Constitution puts republicanism, and I don't mean this in terms of political parties, I mean this in terms of electoral structures. It puts republicanism ahead of democracy. And as we'll explore with the Electoral College, and then we might expand the lens out a little bit and talk about representation and democracy generally, our American representational structures are, in a sense, meant to limit the effect of democracy, right? Meant to limit democracy. The founders thought democracy was a bad thing. They thought of it as a threat. And in fact, in a presentation I just gave a couple of weeks ago, I started out with a quote talking about how it was the genius of the Republican design of the United States that democracy and its excesses towards egalitarianism should be limited. Now, it's just us here, right? So we can talk about this. And let's talk about what we're talking about. What we're talking about is a system that was meant to limit Black people to slavery, that was meant to limit women to property, that treats Native people as foreigners in a land that they got to first. to advantage old white men of property who were deemed to be the respectable governing forces of society. That's what I hear when people say America's a republic, not a democracy. And with that lens in mind, my argument in a nutshell is that the Electoral College is a relic of that mindset. And that ought to open us up to questions about whether, to what extent, and how we should change it. So let's get into it. I wrote a far longer description of this. All right, so this is the polite version of what I just said, right? The Electoral College is a part of the original Republican vision of the American constitutional design that limited democratic participation and reinforced a political economy of slavery. While the Electoral College is now distinct from the political economy of slavery, at least in a formal sense, right, it continues to arguably distort authentic democracy. This, coupled with other functions and structures that distort full representation, is what I want to get into. So in other words, the Electoral College is just as bad as gerrymandering. It does the same kind of thing, and it opens us to this question of, well, shouldn't we just popularly elect the president? And if you believe that, then shouldn't we have a more fair and equitable representation in all our political structures? That's where I want to head. Now, I have a map here. I want to start by laying down some theory. Republicanism, democracy, republicanism, and the American state. I want to start by talking about where this structure is designed and kind of use thinking about democracy to measure things against the sort of democratic republic that's the United States. And then I want to get into that core problem, right? Republicanism is the antithesis of democracy. And then from there, we'll get into the Electoral College specifically and think about its problems, and then expand our lens out to think about gerrymandering and sort of representation distortion more generally, and then possibilities for reform. And in my class, I would ordinarily stop at this point and ask if there are any questions, but we'll save those for the end. So, a democracy, republicanism, and the American state. So I have to lay down a little theory in order to create sort of a measuring stick by which to sort of think about our current situation. So the first thing that we can ask is, what is democracy? And then we'll come back and ask what republicanism is. So democracy in its simplest form is government by the people, right? The idea that the people, well, it's really a set of ideas, right? One important idea is that the people are the sovereign, not some subset of the people, not just the rich people, not just one particular person. So not a king, not an oligarchy. So there's a privileged class, not any other subset of people, but all the people hold sovereignty. They're supreme. The authority comes from this. And if the people do not give a mandate to government, then the government is not legitimate. Another way of thinking about democracy is as a mode of election, right? And that gets us into representative versus direct democracy. So if the people are sovereign, then the question becomes, how do the people govern? Now, one way of doing it is having the people govern directly, right? So the people can vote directly as a whole. So we think of that as direct democracy. But the way America works, to state the obvious, is is it works by representative democracy. So the idea is that the people elect their representatives, and it's their representatives who govern in the name of the people. Now, of course, there are a bunch of questions to this. And those questions include the idea of, well, if the people govern, then which people count as the people, which in a way is the question that we've struggled with as a democracy throughout its existence, right? Who counts as we the people? And we'll get back to that, right? But of course, among the people, there are a bunch of questions in terms of who gets treated as a citizen, using the word citizen to say, I have the rights that allow me the full status to govern, to vote, to participate, to govern others, right? And so from there, the question becomes, who is a citizen? Are there classes of people below that? And how are they to be treated? And the like. Now, a third way of thinking about this is democracy as a mode of associated life. And by that, I mean, to live in a democracy is often treated as living in a society where everybody who is a citizen and everybody who participates in the life is treated as equal to each other. Right? There's no people who get set aside. There's no special status beyond that of, are you a citizen versus are you not a citizen? And everyone who is citizen gets the same level of rights. But everyone, including citizens and not citizens, also gets some level of rights protection by the law, dignity, if you will. And those notions of dignity, equality, the ability to participate, the ability for anyone to be a representative, and to ensure that we are being represented, those are the kinds of values that democracy embodies. Now, it's fair then to say that as a structure, then, democracy and its championing of, ultimately, to put it in one word, equality, is a relatively new invention, right? It comes about, the American state arises and we get we the people to form a more perfect union, and the Declaration of Independence talking about all men are created equal, as flawed as that idea is, because of course I can't hear all men are created equal without thinking to myself, well, you mean all white men. And in fact, you mean all white men, right? I can't hear that without thinking that. But at least the idea was put on the table. And we've had to keep amending and reworking the Constitution, and we'll get to the Reconstruction era in just a minute. But that is the theory, right? Everybody who is a citizen is treated equally, and there's no meaningful distinction between any of those people. But then that larger value of all people are treated equally and with dignity comes into play too. And the fact of the matter is, it's taken us 2.5 centuries. And really, if we're thinking about Africans in America, right, it's taken us 4 centuries and counting to get there. But let's compare that with republicanism. Now, as I said, the functioning of a democracy begins with the questions of citizenship and structure. If the people are sovereign, but direct democracy is impractical, then we need some agent to act on behalf of the people. And in a sense, that's what republicanism. A republic is a structure of government where a set of the citizens govern on behalf of all of the citizenry. Now, this thus means representative democracy is supposed to be the default of republicanism. And and by the way, if you're a history buff like me, every time you hear republicanism, you think about the republic, and all the way back to like the Roman Republic at the turn of the first millennium of the Common Era, like Julius Caesar and all this sort of stuff. I mean, the idea being that we can divide each up into regions and create states, if you will, in the modern parlance, and that each region governs itself, but then there's a national authority where all those regions are represented, but at each level, there are people who are elected to execute sovereignty on behalf of the sovereign people. So we work out of representative democracy. But I put factionalism there to say that, at least in the American design, the worry was that with direct democracy, you would get the tyranny of the majority, right? And I have a lot more to say about what the founders thought about democracy in just a moment. But the core idea, of course, is by governing as a republic and picking the representatives, you would pick the best representatives to carry out the tasks, and that you would begin with each individual state to pick those representatives. The notion being that there is some connection to locality and home that can be represented through the structure of the state, and that those folks can come together to form a national government. Because when the Constitution was created in 1787, it was sort of laid onto the structure of the 13 colonies. And with that became separate governmental structures, and the whole notion that each colony was originally subject to Britain, but then for the period of the Articles of Confederation, each colony then became an individual state and was its own sovereignty. So American republicanism wanted to build on that rather than eradicate that. Now, this is a big debate during the Constitutional Convention about whether we needed a national government that sort of was supreme to the states, or that the states would do more of the governing and the national government was just be a representative body for things that sort of were about being beyond just one state. The Articles of Confederation was that model, and they tried it for a decade and was like, yeah, this isn't working. So we get to more of this federal model where the states cooperate some, where the states send to national structure, and that the governing would happen that way. But the states then are the baseline, right? They decide what citizenship means, what participation means, and under the sort of the technical term of the elector, and which matters when we get to the Electoral College, that they would determine who would be eligible for that. So this gets us to some of the tensions in this design, some of which I've already alluded to. One, in a republic that is governed by democratic principles, at least some participation for the people, the baseline we undertake is majority rule. The majority wins, and that ought to be the way things happen. The majority picks the president gets to be president for 4 years, then after 4 years, we get to decide again. And then, but notice the president is in relation to Congress, is relation to the Supreme Court, to the national government, and the state government. And by saying that, I mean the institutions basically create a space between the governing and the governed, right? Again, the founders distrusted direct democracy, and I'll show you how much they distrusted it in a moment. But the majority wins, the majority works through the institution, and part of that working through the institution is to protect minority rights, whether that be political minorities, racial minorities, that underlying baseline of citizenship doesn't get damaged no matter what rule the majority creates. So political theorists will tell you democracy doesn't work if we don't have those three things: majority rule, political institutions that help shape things for the greater good, and the protection of minority rights. Implicit in that is inclusion as a democratic value, that everybody ought to feel like they are included and get the opportunity to exercise participation. But of course, as I've already said, that's all well and good as a theoretical matter, but the flaw is that by definition, we've only included the people, or not we. Yeah, I mean, let me back up a second. This is not about we, as in us, as in people of African descent. The we that the people represent was the wealthy, white property owners who the designers of this governmental structure themselves thought were the only people who would be worthy of the exercise of the franchise. And so they not only did not want slaves to be participants, they were property. And as I've alluded to earlier, natives were dangerous foreigners, and women were merely there to produce babies and to hold property. Men of property were the ones to be trusted. And part of this is the right, and it's the flaw that we have continued to try to undo. And the Electoral College is part of that flaw. So in talking about this, I'm going to talk about the flawed premise a little bit more. And then get to the views of the founders about democracy, and then talk about this political economy of slavery as this cornerstone for all this. Now, in my research, these words by Thurgood Marshall, our late great brother in justice, seem to sum up for me the flaw, right? And I picked these words because he's couching it in the fact that America had to evolve from where it started from. So in this sense, he says, for a sense of the evolving nature of the Constitution, we need look no further than the first three words of the document's preamble: we the people. When the founding fathers used this phrase in 1787, they did not have in mind the majority of American citizens. We the people included, in the words of the framers, the whole number of free persons. On a matter so basic as the right to vote, for example, Negro slaves were excluded, although they were counted for representational purposes as 3/5 each. Women did not gain the right to vote for over 130 years. The flaw is that we the people only meant white men. And yet our society grew and evolved, as Justice Marshall is saying. And at each turn, we have had to evolve our system to accommodate that. But every time there was an evolution, there was pushback. Every time we gain more, then we find a way of cutting that off. And to me, this forms a cycle. I call it the cyclical pattern of democracy distortion. If we believe we, the people, are governed and we create institutions to govern for us, and we have a republic to carry out our democracy, we also have to realize that every time we try to include people in our democracy, there's somebody saying coded ideological persuasion, right? Those people aren't worthy. Those people shouldn't be part of this, right? They then say, well, if they're around, we have to create a way of blocking them. And that creates fear, threats of destabilization. And so the exclusion gets justified. We can block them. We can exclude them. We don't want them there. But then there's inevitably a story of action about how to get people involved. And inclusion gets affirmed. We see this with the right to vote. We've had this conversation about gerrymandering. We haven't really seriously had this conversation about the Electoral College yet, at least not at the point where real reform can happen. And to me, this is one of the possibilities. Now, this cycle represents a kind of politics, right? The belief, I think, that inclusion has to be measured on some form of identity, right? And this cycle repeats again and again. But every time we're talking about what our structure should be and what they ought to be, what we're really talking about is worthy. Who's worthy to carry out the right to vote? Who's worthy to determine who ought to be the president? And I think the Electoral College is not an exception to this. Now, as I say, though, the Electoral College, first and foremost, serves as a way to protect the political structure from the threat of democracy. The founders thought that democracy was equated to mob rule. The founders thought that allowing all the people eligible to vote directly on the things that matter would destroy the ability for the founders and the economic interests that they represented to carry out business as usual, right? If well, actually, let's just look at their words. James Madison believed, viewing the subject in its merits alone, the freeholders of the country would be the safest depositories of Republican liberty. Now let's take that statement apart for just a second, right? The greatest repositories, the safest depositories of Republican liberty. The freeholders, men who are able to hold property, men who are eligible in each state to make the decision, the freeholders of the country, the safest depositories of Republican liberty. We can trust them the most to carry out the values of this republic. And Republican liberty is often code for, well, within this republic where we govern by states and states can carry out their business as they so choose, whether that be trade, whether that be owning land, whether that be owning slaves, that the freeholders, the people who are already invested in the system as it is, are going to protect all those things in the system. And so governing and elections ought to be in service of protecting that interest of us being able to carry out business as usual, if you will. And by the way, in that sense, this is what I mean by political economy, right? Money and interest of the government and the freedom to go about and do what one wishes to do with one's rights, that those things service the end of creating and protecting property, of supporting the state, and ultimately letting people have life, liberty. And in the original version, you think about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What they were really saying is life, liberty, as in not being constrained by the government in the pursuit of property. So, in that sense, this is what Madison's talking about. Alexander Hamilton, the guy who's celebrated in the musical, right? Alexander Hamilton, do. How does a bastard, orphan, son of a... So, but here's what he had to say about democracy, right? All communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first are the rich and well-born. The others, the mass of the people. The voice of the people has been said to be the voice of God. And however generally this maxim has been quoted and believed, it is not true in fact. The people are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge or determine right. Give, therefore, to the first, the rich and well-born, a distinct permanent share in the government. They will check the unsteadiness of the second. The rich and well-born, let them govern, and they'll keep the unwashed masses in check. This is how the founders viewed democracy. John Adams, he even had his own TV special. In Hamilton the Musical, he got insulted. But the second president of the United States, an important founder, here was his view. Such is the frailty of the human heart, that very few men who have no property have any judgment of their own. They talk and vote as they are directed by some man of property who has attached their minds to his interest. Or we can't trust people who don't own property because they're going to be manipulated. They're going to just make decisions on their own. They'll get bribed. They'll get cajoled. They won't speak with their own mind. So let's just exclude them altogether. In a way, and you think about our politics today where everybody's getting fixated on voter fraud and this sort of thing, I think that even from the very beginning in the founding of the Republic, right, this value of a man having to have his own stead in his own property to be worthy of independent thought, to think about governing, this kind of thing is at the heart of that kind of ideology, right? There are some people who are worthy of this. There are some people who are not. Now, if you layer upon that this political economy of slavery that defines people as slaves and treats them as such, and in a way, it's a mindset, right? Even the poor white people fit into Adams's view, and they should be excluded. They're just means to an end, just like slaves are means to an end. The people who own property ought to be able to govern. Now, this understanding informs how we need to understand the Electoral College. So, the Electoral College. Let me set up these considerations. First of all, when the Constitution was being written and debated, everyone, well, almost everyone, agreed that there should be an elected executive and an elected legislature. But the question became, who should elect? Now, ironically, of course, Hamilton and his rich and the poor kind of thinking was one of the few who believed that there should be a king in the United States. But everybody else was like, no, we're done with kings. So let's have a president. And the nature of the presidency was that there should be an executive who, in essence, works in relation with the legislature to create laws. And the initial dispute was over how much power should each group have, right? And the original notion was that the legislature could be responsive to the states and to the people to build up the laws and carry out sort of what was done at home, where the president was to be more about, well, foreign affairs. He was to represent the United States. He would collaborate as chief legislator, hence the veto power and the power to propose laws. And they can check each other. The president can veto Congress. Congress can override the president's veto. The president runs the government, but Congress sets the budget. All of these checks and balances, right? And the court would play referee. Now, but fundamental to this was the notion that the states ought to be represented in these sorts of decision making. So the question ultimately became, how do we make sure that the states be represented and involved? So one of the choices was, well, we create the national legislature and then the legislature elects the president. There are people who thought, well, that's too far removed from the states, right? The states become secondary. Then there were people who thought, well, the states could vote and elect the president directly. No, no, no. We just wrote a whole bunch of stuff saying we hate democracy in the sense of the people picking directly. And importantly, too, part of the debate was that there was very little partisanship as we know it today. Political parties had not formed strong views about whether there should be a strong national government or strong state-center government, right? You remember that from high school history and U.S. poli-sci as the Federalists versus the anti-Federalists. But folks hadn't formed into groups around this. Now, of course, I'll just say at this point that when I say representation and distortion, I mean that these debates were happening among a small leading class, right? To borrow from Hamilton's few and the many, right? It was the few having this conversation. So from the get-go, this is inherently distorted. Now, yet the states were the baseline, right? The Constitutional Convention, even though it redesigned a new federal government and built a relationship between the federal government and the states, it wasn't going to throw out the model of having states. So states retained sovereignty in that sense. So we don't want to elect the president directly. We don't want the states to not be involved. And so the Electoral College becomes a representative structure that deliberates on who ought to be the president. The underlying theory is this notion of virtual representation. And I've already hinted at it, right? That only those who are propertied are worthy to govern. But the next sentence is, those worthy to govern can be trusted to represent the interests of everybody, right? So the landed property owners in each state, it's okay that they're the only ones who get to vote because we can trust them to represent the interests of everybody in the state, including those lower masses who aren't worthy. There's someone who will, by virtue of who they are, represent their interests. You can tell I'm a cynic about this, right? So the Electoral College becomes the manifestation of that. The landowners pick who's in the legislature. The legislature picks representatives to go to Washington and deliberate about who ought to be the president. And then they vote, right? This becomes the structure. The original Constitution, I should have put Article 2 of the Constitution, lays out how to choose the president. We pick the folks go to Washington, there's a seat for every member of the House or I should say the number of seats that each state gets is based on the number of representatives in the House that the state gets, the 2 representatives for the Senate, but it's not the representatives and the senators, it's who the people in the legislature believe ought to take up those seats. They go, they deliberate, they vote, they bring in a slate, and then they count the votes in Washington. Now, that process was further codified and refined in the 12th Amendment. And then just to run through the changes quickly, the 20th Amendment moved the process from working to have a president sworn in by March to having a president sworn in by January 20th. The presidency was limited to 2 terms. The District of Columbia was added in addition to states. And then the 25th Amendment sort of addresses what happens in the case of a vacancy. But what's really important is thinking about how it works today. So from Governing Magazine, I got this infographic, and they drew this based on 2020. But the basic numbers are there. 538, so each representative for the House of Representatives and the 100 senators, 270 to win. And each state gets votes based on their senatorial and House numbers, right? So, California has something like 55. Wyoming, the smallest state, gets 3. And so there's 1 elector for each college. I'm sorry, for each vote in the Electoral College. Those electors meet in early December. And now, according to federal statute and state law, the electors have to, unless state law provides otherwise, and there are a couple of states who do it differently, all the electors in a state have to vote for who wins the popular vote in the state. So, if we think about it in terms of each state, it's a winner-take-all system. And from that perspective, right, the votes are piecemeal. They're not necessarily representative of all of the votes in that state, but it's a rough approximation. Now, there are 2 exceptions to this. Nebraska and Maine, we'll pick on Maine. Well, actually, they both have 5 electoral college votes. Each congressional district gets 1 vote. So whoever wins the congressional district in Nebraska's 3, they get 1 vote. The remaining 2 votes go to the winner of the statewide vote. So I have good friends in Omaha, Nebraska, right? And the congressional district surrounding Omaha is reliably Democratic. But the other 2 districts are reliably Republican, and so they ordinarily win the state. So you get, in the last election, 4 votes going for Trump, 1 vote going for Biden in Nebraska. But in all the other states, you get the entire total. So if we take, for example, Ohio, right? Ohio has 18 had 18 electoral votes in 2020. In 2024, it has 17 electoral votes because with reapportionment every 10 years, the vote number can change, right? Population gets elected, increases, decreases. Ohio's has decreased. So it gets 17 electoral votes, right? Just looking very quickly at, I pulled up some things to look at. a number of websites highly predict that Trump will win Ohio, despite what might well be the actual popular vote representation, which I would bet would be somewhere around 53% Republican, 47% Democrat. So if you look at population, Ohio's really a purple state, but 17 votes for Trump happened because it's all winner take all. So this sets up a number of important questions, among which is the issue of the minority election of the president. Now, if you look at the electoral map across the board, and the one slide that I realize I should have created but didn't, but maybe afterwards I can actually Google something for us to share to look at the end, right? One of the challenges is if you look at the electoral map and you think about the number of votes, there's always a possibility, given this winner-take-all structure, that the total number of electoral votes doesn't represent the majority of the popular vote. So as we saw in recent years, in both 2020 with the election of George W. Bush and 2016 with the election of Trump, the opponents there, Al Gore versus W and Hillary Clinton versus Trump, they actually won the popular vote. But the way the Electoral College works, Trump ekes out a narrow Electoral College victory, given this winner-take-all structure. And the reality is that the swing states, the states where the election is most heavily contested, and there are enough votes in the Electoral College to create a route to victory, those states end up being the ones that define it. So, and stop and think about it this way, right? The election comes down to, say, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, Florida. That doesn't really represent the entirety of the nation. Anybody who might say that Arizona or Florida or Michigan represents the entirety of the US, yeah, I don't know. But the challenge, I think, is that the Electoral College ends up creating a path to win through only a few states. And when we have minority presidents, right? Minority in the sense of a minority of Americans chose these folks, then we end up questioning the legitimacy of their election, right? If you think about, in some ways, I can remember just starting my career working for Judge Beatty, Election Day 2000. I can remember, the month of hemming and hawing about the process, right? The votes had to be counted. We saw the litigation in Florida. The Supreme Court put a stop to it. Everybody was talking about how the Supreme Court basically put a stop to the vote in Florida, and therefore they rigged the election. And it became a mess. And yet, for all his flaws that I remember calling out in 2000, at least George W. Bush played it cool, right? He tried to at least sound like a uniter. But then compare that to Trump. Trump started creating this myth that he lost the popular vote because of illegal voters. And he has been building on this rhetoric of dissension. And I think part of that is to cover the fact that he was only elected by a minority of the people was basically covering for the illegitimacy of his election. And then, of course, he loses in 2020 by a sound majority and then tries to reinvent that myth of voter fraud. And we can talk in the Q&A about what we might worry about next week. But I think the democratic instinct of most Americans is that an election appears legitimate if the majority of the people back the president, right? Back to those democratic values that I talked about. The highest value of democracy is majority rule. And the Electoral College, by design, was meant to prevent majority rule. And so you get more demands for the popular vote, right? One solution here is to abolish the Electoral College by constitutional amendment and simply elect the president by simple majority vote. Changing the Constitution takes a lot of work, right? There's basically two paths to proposing an amendment. You either need to get 2/3 of both houses of Congress to vote for it, or you convene a national convention where that has representatives from every state that then proposes an amendment. So 2 ways of proposing it. 2 ways of ratification. You either call conventions in each state, and 2/3 of the state conventions have to approve the proposed amendments, or the state legislatures of 2/3 of the states approve the amendment. So mix and match ways. Moral of the story, it's hard to amend the Constitution. Again, another protection from democratic impulses. So demands for the popular vote are probably not going to go anywhere in the near future. So state legislatures have picked up workarounds. I've already told you about the workaround that Maine and Nebraska selected. There's also the Electoral College Compact, where enough states to add up to a majority, like more than 270 electoral votes, there is talks of those states coming into an agreement so that the legislatures agree that whoever wins the national popular vote will automatically get those 270 plus votes. That's still under discussion, and there are questions about its constitutionality. But the heart of this is that these structures, even though in their modern form, represent the majority that wins in each particular state, the structure is designed so that that's not the majority of everyone in the United States together. So you get this risk. And then layer on top of that, that this structure was meant to protect the political economy of slavery, right? That the representation, i.e. the number of seats that the South had during the antebellum era, was augmented by the number of slaves, gives us further context for the Electoral College. Now, obviously, the abolition of slavery removed that formal rule, but it opened up the fact that counting the number of people it takes to get representation in Congress is a way to bolster representation, and we can structure how the vote works. The point is that slavery is intertwined with the Electoral College, and slavery is intertwined with gerrymandering generally. So I wanted to take 5 minutes to talk about gerrymandering in and of itself. Now, if we think about representation in this sense, every person gets represented by their elected official, and they should have an equal say in who those elected officials are, then any structure that basically makes one state's votes worth another, the people in one state's votes worth more than another state or with districts within that state, if you sort of empower one group over another in any way that just goes beyond straight up and down counting the votes, you're getting distortion, right? So even though people might participate, are people thoroughly being represented? Now, to just take a basic idea of gerrymandering, we can create a 50-person grid, 20 are red, 30 are blue. So 60% blue, 40% red. If this group votes as one, blue always wins because blue gets 30 votes, red gets 20 votes. Now, if we broke it down into 5 districts, and this is how gerrymandering works, right? We can draw the districts so that we get 3 blue, 2 red in a perfect representation state. But then we can draw the districts differently, with the requirement that there be 10 in each district, but we can cut across the boundaries so that the districts are compact, right? It's a perfect rectangle, but blue becomes the majority in each district and red is never represented. So you get 5 districts where blue always wins. But then we get neither compact nor fair. I draw the same district with the same number, but I can draw them in such a way that I can create 3 districts where where red wins and 2 districts where blue wins. And so red ends up being the winner, even though blue is actually the numerical majority within our system. So I guess the question on the local level, just to put it out there briefly, there are 2 ways of gerrymandering on the state and local level. Partisan gerrymandering, where we advantage political parties, so red and blue is Republicans and Democrats, or racial gerrymandering, where the red and blue are different racial groups. Now, I won't go into the technicalities of these names, but suffice it to say that the Voting Rights Act and a case called Shaw v. Reno were about addressing racial gerrymandering. The federal courts said in Ruccio versus Common Cause that there's no way of addressing partisan gerrymandering. But as we know, on the ballot next week is Ohio's solution for a citizen initiative commission. But the question I want to pose here is that it seems to me that the Electoral College is just another form of this representation distortion that lies in the heart of gerrymandering. Now, it's worth saying it lies even on the local government. So it's not about state reps, it's about local seats in cities. By counting prisoners into the population, you can have prison gerrymandering. Women might end up being underrepresented in various ways. And most recently, I recall the Tennessee 3, where properly elected Black representatives were pushed out of the state legislature in Tennessee for basically being accused of acting up by protesting gun control legislation and just simple representation stripping. The third person here, the Caucasian woman, was similarly chided, but not excluded from the legislature. Now, the brothers here were restored to their seats because it threw the election back to the people and the people immediately voted them back in. But suffice it to say, there's lots of representation distortion that we have to think about. So let me take 2 minutes to talk about possibilities, and that hopefully will leave us 15 minutes for questions. So abolishing the Electoral College is difficult. We've since already talked about how difficult it is to amend the Constitution. And there are options like the state compact to try to represent the majority of votes. But there's a third statutory reform worth mentioning, and it also would treat gerrymandering, and that's proportional representation. Winner take all as the form of elections in America, excuse me, right, winner take all has been the tradition for congressional elections. It's by statute, and certainly the Constitution and the Electoral Count Act make it law for the Electoral College. Yes, states can divide up by districts, but what if we made it one election across the United States? And on the state and local levels, rather than winner take all districts, we instead said political parties can run, and then we look at the proportion of what the party wins across the jurisdiction and allocate representation that way. Now, there are a variety of ways of doing it. We can have preferential voting. We can have straight proportional representation. We can have a combination of proportion and single member districts. But the whole notion of winner take all is the theoretical basis of all this. So one other reform to put on the table is, what if we got rid of all that? I mean, it would be more closely related to structures of democracy, in the sense that you have a sense of proportional representation of the people, and that the way the people vote ought to dictate who all the representatives ought to be. But at the same time, you can create the structure to limit how many seats there are in a legislative body, or in terms of the Electoral College, making sure that there is a majority consistent with the will of the people that chooses the president. Moreover, at the end of the day, the founders' idea that the majority can't be trusted is the ultimate heart of all this. I've said throughout the presentation, it's racial implications. The whole idea of the Electoral College is that you can trust the learned to pick the best prepared. But what if we flip that around and we made sure everybody was prepared to participate, without buying the premise that virtual representation ought to be a thing? What if we instead made the majority vote the way of saying everybody's invested? I don't care if you're in Wyoming or California or Ohio or Florida, everybody's vote counts. And then we structured our laws to help that, as a matter of making it easy to vote, protecting everyone's vote, and actually creating an educational system that helped prepare everyone to vote. If you look across other countries, you see this in all kinds of ways. You know, election day is a holiday. Elections are given space for people. It's easy to register. In some countries, you don't even need to register at all. All of this politics of worthiness around a vote infect how we think about the vote. So in critiquing the Electoral College, it's essential that we see these politics of worthiness as shaping it. And if we see it that way, then we can critique it for what it really is. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Professor Ellis, for giving us such a thorough and truly fascinating presentation. There are a number of questions in the chat, and we will touch upon a few of them. The first one comes from Charmaine asking, how did Nebraska and Maine become outliers with their split electoral votes? And why was it just those two states?
Well, I think they were the only ones who bothered to do it. I mean, and they amended their, they amended their laws, right? There's nothing that says, I mean, the reverse of a lot of what I was saying in terms of each state sends its slate of electors. There's nothing that says that the state can't structure for itself who the electors ought to be. Now, of course, this opens up a different set of questions, and I would bet that this question might be in the chat as well. If Maine and Nebraska can make this choice, then the question I'm asking is, and the question that President Trump seems to have been asking every now and then, is why can't the states just choose to elect him regardless of what the popular vote says? And I think the answer to that is, at least, that would endanger the legitimacy of the process. And I think most legislatures just know better than to try to say, oh, we're going to ignore the popular vote. It also raises constitutional issues, right? Article 4 of the Constitution has what's called the guarantee clause, or the Republican form of government clause. It says the national government shall ensure that each state has a Republican form of government. And as I've defined republicanism, the idea is that republicanism is ultimately a manifestation of democracy, right? There's no legitimacy without including the popular vote in some way. The Electoral College puts the popular vote at arm's length from the actual decision, but it doesn't erase it. And so to be a legitimate democratic republic, ignoring the popular vote entirely would arguably violate the guarantee clause. So 2 questions for the price of 1, including a question you may or may not have known you wanted to ask.
That's awesome. Thank you.
What else?
Another question coming from Hallie, who says, I heard something about the red mirage and the blue shift. What does that mean, and how does it affect the electoral vote process?
The red mirage and the blue shift. My guess is that that is a problem more of polling than the Electoral College in and of itself. Because part of this is, you pick a campaign based on the idea that I can use polling to predict where my best chances of picking up votes are, and I can figure out what states it's not worth polling in, right? So the idea then becomes, I can sort of predict what the swings are. I think by red mirage, we've seen historically that Republicans have kind of outperformed what was reported in the polls. And similarly, the blue shift is, I would take to mean, Democrats have shifted more to the right politically. And so, but this underlying problem is polling doesn't necessarily represent what people will actually go do. They might lie to pollsters, or you might get under participation in order to make an accurate statistical prediction. So what you might expect by reading the newspaper or watching cable news may end up being different from what actually ends up happening. Now, the problem, of course, is people then look at the results and, make up their own conspiracy theories about, well, what actually happened here? I've been lied to, therefore it's not legitimate, even though the reality is that polling is not perfect. And it seems to me more important to watch how the candidates and how the campaigns perform, how they work to get out the vote, to see who's actually showing up at the polls. And if you're going to watch polling, you should watch, reaction polls after people voted, because then the incentive for them to lie is probably less.
Thank you. Now, you described the process to amend the U.S. Constitution. So, Camille asks, how long would that process take?
Probably on the order of years. Usually, with the more modern constitutional amendments, many of them have had a sunset provision, right? If the states don't approve it, somewhere around 5 to 7 years, then the amendment becomes void. So that's the kind of time scale of trying to amend the Constitution.
And another question about the Constitution. Danola asks, can the 14th Amendment be used to challenge the constitutionality of the Electoral College?
You would think, but and I see the logic of that, but the ultimate answer is no. Although there's a strong argument, right? The argument I would think would be this, right? The Electoral College was in the original Constitution, modified by the 12th Amendment, and for all intents and purposes, that's where the working issue comes. The 14th Amendment builds into it the promise of equal protection of the laws. And the Supreme Court, beginning with a case called Baker v. Carr and then Reynolds v. Sims, basically said the equal protection of the law, which basically means people ought to be treated equally when they're being distinguished by legal structures. When it comes to voting, every vote ought to be counted equally and treated equally. So one person, one vote. Each electoral district needs to have the same number of people and have the same number of votes roughly in order to win. I can see that logic being a lens to look at the Electoral College. If different states have effective power to help choose the presidency outside of what their population is, then the states aren't being equal. And therefore, that ought to be a problem. But I can't think of a case where that's been seriously allowed to go forward. And my suspicion is that the two are treated separately in as much as the Electoral College is about structure, and to take a strict interpretation approach, right? The Equal Protection Clause is about individual citizens. I would love to argue that theory, though, at some point. I might note y'all in a law review article making that argument. So
And we might make
I'll credit if I end up writing.
That sounds great. Related to that, Marcus asked, is the Electoral College a group of people or a process? And how are electors appointed?
Come in. Hello?
Yes. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I froze there for about 20 seconds.
Oh, okay. No problem. So along with that, the question is the Electoral College a group of people or a process? And how are the electors appointed and what are the qualifications?
Okay. So I think it's best to think of the Electoral College as a process where groups of people from each state gather to vote for the president and the vice president. And part of the statutory and constitutional change, the one thing I forgot to mention earlier was back in the day, there wasn't partisanship. So the president could end up from one party, the vice president ordinarily would come from another party. But part of the change between the 12th Amendment and Congressional Act was that the president and the vice president would be from the same party, because having the Prez and the VP be from different parties creates trouble, right? That was part of the problem of the election of 1800. To be an elector, right, the qualifications for electors are determined by the state. In modern practice, basically, each party offers a slate of people who are adults eligible to vote. And in practice, they're members of their particular parties, high-profile members of their party, right? And so the practicality is that election day happens, the election is certified by the state, the governor of the state signs off on the result. By law, then, the winning party gets to send its slate of electors. They convene on the day picked in the Constitution and in statute, somewhere like December 6th. They go through the symbolism of casting the vote. Those things are sealed and certified and then transmitted to Washington. Then on January 6th, Lord willing, January 6th next year ain't a mess, the House and Senate gather and hold a ceremony where the vice president, as presiding officer, because the vice president's also president of the Senate, presides over the counting of each report from each state's electoral college. And at that point, the vice president certifies who will be the president and vice president elect. And then those folks are sworn in on January 20th.
Great. I'm going to ask one last question, but as I do that, I just want to let everyone know that I've dropped the link to the survey in the chat. It is a brief survey. You can give your feedback and also tell us what topics you would like us to touch upon in this series. So the last question I'll ask is from Charmaine. If issue 1 passes in Ohio, what would be the noticeable impact on the state?
So what you would immediately have with the passage of issue 1 is the creation of the commission over probably the following 9 months or so. And then soon thereafter, efforts to redraw state, Senate, and representative boundaries. So to put it simply, that would be the noticeable effect, and that would probably shift some districts eventually. And then, of course, you would see that they would go through that process of selecting. The initial 6 people are picked, then 15 more people. You would get a full commission. They would hear hearings, that they would go around the state, and they would gear up to changing things. And then, of course, every 10 years after the census, a new commission is commissioned, and they would go through the process again.
Great. Thank you so much. Meredith, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay. Professor Ellis, can you stop sharing your screen? Well, let's give him a virtual clap. I hope I'm not the only nerd that was totally engorged in every word that he was saying. Hamilton, I wish we had some music up and some dueling going on. But Professor, I look forward to inviting you back for more of this. I feel like I would do really well in your class. So thank you for sharing. I know you're very passionate about it, and
Yeah,
thank you for making it digestible for us.
it's my pleasure. Has the screen share stopped?
Yes,
I couldn't
yes,
really tell. Okay, great.
it has stopped.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure.
You are welcome, and thank you so much. So I just have a few housekeeping things. I want to thank my chair, my social action chair, co-chair, Cheryl Lindsay. Merle Johnson wasn't able to be with us tonight, another co-chair. Thank you, technology. Thank you to all the Delta members that are on this evening. Your presence is much appreciated. To all the young ladies, we had a few guys on here too. Thank you for joining. But I just want to remind you that today is the deadline, 8:30 actually, so 28 minutes. If you plan on voting by mail, today is the deadline, and that you needed to get that application in by 8:30 today. The voting schedule for the rest of this week, Wednesday through Friday, Board of Elections opens at 7:30 a.m. and it closes at 7:30 p.m. So those hours are extended for the week. Saturday, they're open from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. And then on Sunday from 1 to 5 p.m. So we will be down there with a bunch of our sister organizations, fraternities, on Sunday from 1 to 3, doing our stroll to the polls, souls to the polls. I understand there are going to be some other special guests there, so feel free to come out and join us. That's a free event open to the public. Even though we'll be there representing our colors and our letters, it is not inclusive. So please, exclusive. So please come and join us. We'll be out there. Polls open at what time on election day? Anybody?
7:30? Is it 7:30?
What?
Is it 7:30?
6:30.
6:30.
6:30 a.m. The polls close at what time?
Oh, 7:30.
7:30. So if you're in line, if there are long lines, if you're in line by 7:30, you'll still get an opportunity to vote on election day. If you're planning to mail your ballot, if you're voting by mail, you will need $1.01 postage. Please make sure that it is postmarked by November 4th. So that's the day before, right? It's the day before election. Has to be postmarked. What else? You have any other questions? Visit boe.cuyahoga-county.gov. If you have questions about your polling location changes. I know in Shaker there were quite a few changes. We don't vote at Woodbury anymore. That was my polling location. It's been moved to the Stephanie Tubbs Jones Community Center. So make sure that you are aware of your polling location. You cannot vote at your polling location during the early voting period, only on election day. If there's any kind of issue with your ID or your address matching where you currently live on your ID, there's a possibility that you may be required to vote provisionally. It's okay. Just cast your ballot and then make any corrections that you need to correct within the time period that they tell you. They'll give you a slip of paper with instructions if you are indeed a provisional voter, but your vote will count, just not on election night. Okay. Once the problem is fixed, it will be counted. What else? So yeah, we'll be down at the Board of Elections on Sunday for Souls to the Polls. On November 23rd, we'll be celebrating our scholarship roundup. So if you're interested in our scholarship roundup, tickets are $45. You can find that information on the Greater Cleveland Alumni Chapter's website. Outside of that, I want to thank you so much for your time. This was a very fascinating topic tonight, right? There's so much that we still need to know about the system of governance that we live within. So, Professor Ellis, we look forward to inviting you back. Thank you for being with us this evening, and we will see you next time. Maybe in person next time. All right.
That'd be great.
Okay. Because great presenter. Appreciate
Thank
you. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Night.
Good night.
Night.
All right. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and complete the survey myself. All right. Thank you, Sora. Good night.
Thank you. Great.